So today I wanted to teach about painting a place called Mabry Mill. And it's one of those old water mills, but this painting, particularly I liked about it was the focus on thick paint. There's thick textural paint all over. It was painted quickly, Alla Prima, all in one session. And there's a lot of little color nuances all throughout it. But particularly I wanted to show how to, the background trees, how to get a trunk of a tree to come down over already thick paint that's on there. Everything's still wet. How to get that, something like a trunk to come down over that thick paint and make it all work. And why painting Alla Prima, why I love it so much, why it's so much fun, and how we can manipulate edges and blend little bits of color together so that it all harmonizes so well. So let's get to that right now. Okay, so right off the bat, let me show you the painting that we're talking about right here. That's the painting. Now, it's going to show up on your screen probably looking a lot larger than it is. It's just an 8 by 10, but it was so much fun. And this was one of the paint-togethers we had with our members, where this was actually started about 3 years ago by one of our members, where she said, hey, how about if because we were doing these monthly paint critiques where members send in photos, I critique their paintings. We did that every month. And she wanted to do a painting, have a critique session where we all painted the same thing. And I thought that was a great idea. So we started every other month now. We do a thing where we all paint together. We choose either one of my images or an image from one of our members, and we send that out to everybody. And so everyone who wants to participate paints from the same image. This was one of those, and this image actually came from one of our members. So Mabry Mill, let me show you what those images look like that she sent. Oops, let me get over here. Okay, so here's this is the image that our member provided for everybody, and there were just a lot of things in here that I really enjoyed. In fact, one of the things that seemed particularly interesting to me, did I get the right tool? Right there. And I need a different, no, it's got the right color. Okay. Let me get my brush right, sorry. I am not amazing with Photoshop or quick. So I loved this tree back here. Wow, that's interesting. Sorry, that's the textured brush I use for the critiques actually. Let me get a regular brush on here, wherever they are. There we go, that should work. There we are. Okay, so that tree back there, so cool. It just got all kinds of character to it. But when I looked at this image, the first thing I had to decide was what to leave in here. What is the painting about in the first place? What am I going after? And to me, it was about the mill. When I look at this, that's really what this is all about, is that mill. But there are other things in there that I also wanted to explore. And so I had to decide, how can I explore some of those things, like the reflections in the water, the background trees, and things like that, without taking too much attention away from the mill. So first of all, I decided I better crop this. And so this is what I did with the cropping. I took out all of that right here in the beginning, all of this down here. I just thought, well, you know what, there's some fun stuff there. The fence might be a good lead into the painting, that sort of thing. But to me, it wasn't what I was going for, and I felt like it took away some of the focus there on the mill. So I cropped it down so that we get a more intimate picture of that mill. it's much closer to the viewer. It takes up a greater portion of real estate in the painting. And I set it, I like that it's lower down here. It's, you know, down here like this. We've got it lower down and we've still got all this space up here. That to me was a fun design. So I decided that there wasn't a lot in here that I needed to change as far as the overall design that was there. I like it. So I went with basically how it is. But this scraggly tree back here that is so cool, so interesting by itself, I didn't feel like it was really, because at first I was going to paint that. I just thought that is really cool. I want to have that in there. And then I realized, you know what? If I put that in there, I don't know if it's really going to contribute to the mill. And so the more the painting progressed, very quickly I realized that wasn't it. That was not going to be working as far as putting the emphasis on that mill. But there were some other things I could do, especially in a small piece. I don't want it to just be a picture of the mill, because the photograph does that just fine. So I decided I wanted to work on texture, because in looking at the siding on all this wood, it's all weathered and textured looking. It's just so, it has such a cool patina to it. So I decided that would be something that I could really focus on. We've got the difference in texture between the wood, the rocks, the water, and some of the texture that's back here with the branches and things in the trees. So a lot of things I could do with texture in there. But then as I started putting that in there, I realized too that there were just little bits of color that I wanted to add to make things pop. So right now it's a little bit, to me, kind of sedated as far as the color in here, and I wanted to punch that up a bit. So this is the process that I went through. Let me take you through the video to show you how I approached painting this mill. All right, so I'm going to go back here to 18. You know, I'm going to need these periodically because I cannot see those little tiny numbers down there. So we get over here to 18. 41. And I've got my timeline already. I went through this so I could get you to the things that really stood out to me. All right, so right here, what I'm doing is, see that I've got my brush. Let me grab one of those. And I'll kind of tell you what I'm doing here. So when I'm out, it doesn't matter if I'm out on location or I'm painting here in my studio. This is how I will often measure things. And for me, when I'm talking about measurement, I'm talking about relative measurement, not getting the sizes exactly the size that I see them, because that I'm not worried about. There are advantages to that. There's a method called the sight size method of painting. Artists like Joe McGurl, huge proponents of that. And if you're going outdoors, so especially in the early years, there's a couple of schools of thought on this. Sorry for the hesitation, but I had to think about just how much to explain with this. So when I started out in the 80s in art school, I was enamored with the Russian Impressionist style of painting. And it's not that measurement isn't important. We want to get we want to be accurate in our drawing all the time. But that's almost secondary to the overall, to things like brushwork and shapes and the color and just the feeling, the emotion in the painting. Yeah, I want overall my buildings to feel like they are stable, that the perspective is correct. A lot of the fundamentals that come with drawing, I want those to be accurate. But I wasn't too worried overall about, is this building, is everything in it exactly the way I see it? But with something like the sight size method, you take something like just a card, like a mat board. You take a mat that you're going to put on a picture, and you can use something like a mat or anything, any kind of a frame, put it up, have it to be the same size as the panel that you're painting on, like a 9 by 12. So you have a 9 by 12 mat. You put that up in front of you, like on a tripod or something, or clipped to your easel, and then you paint exactly what you see through that framework, through that frame or mat or whatever you're using. And you paint the values exactly the same, the colors exactly the same, the proportions, everything in there is exactly what you see in front of you. There's a whole lot of benefit to that, because very quickly doing that, our skills as far as accurate color perception and rendering, accurate values, accurate drawing, all of those things, our skills are going to increase immensely in doing that sort of thing. So those are great exercises to do. And often when I go out to paint now, I've been painting outdoors since the mid-'80s. But for the most part, when I would go out and paint on location, I wasn't too worried about that. I was out there just capturing the feeling, very vigorous, and it's kind of the swashbuckling kind of painting. Just having a lot of fun with it. Now when I go out to paint on location, I'm much more focused actually on subtlety and accurate color rendering and things like that to an extent. But not to that degree of sight size method. And that really comes down a lot to personality, to your intent. Why are you out there? A lot of professional artists today who started out with plein air painting, they go out on location today so that they can get, it's like field notes. They're going out there so they can really understand atmosphere and color temperature and values and things like that. And then they come back but they're not out there to finish a painting. They're not out there to get a start to finish painting is done before I leave the site. It's just to get more field notes. And then they come back in, whereas in the early days, they were like, that was me. In the early days, 30 by 40 painting, finish it in 3 or 4 hours, boom, it's done, it's ready to go to a gallery. It's not like that for me anymore today. And for a lot of artists, it's the same way. They go out, they take field notes, then they come back in the studio, and they use those field notes to guide their understanding of what they're painting while they're in the studio. And in the studio, it's more about taking time and being more thoughtful and thinking it through, rather than being subject to the time constraints of being outdoors. It's still important to artists like me and others to go out and paint often on location, because it does inform the way that we think about painting, our understanding of being outdoors. But a lot more painting is done in the studio now than maybe painting outdoors. I hear artists like, oh boy, I just drew a blank on, it's one of my favorite artists too. That's frustrating when the brain suddenly goes blank like that. He's in the Virginia, D.C. area. Crumbs, sorry. I'll maybe his name will come to me here in a little while. But George Carlson, T. Allen Lawson. Boy, I wish I could think of the other. Anyway, that's become kind of a thing for a lot of artists. And it's not where we got together and said, you know what, I think this is what we need to do. It's just kind of, as artists, we go through these transitions. And it might go back the other way again. The pendulum tends to swing. It depends on, at the moment, what we're trying to learn and where we're trying to take our art at that moment. So getting back to the measurements. Sight size method is one way to do it. But this is how I've generally figured out how to get my drawing accurate. And oftentimes I am impatient. And so I don't take enough time in the beginning to do this and get it nailed down right at the beginning. And that comes back to bite me more often than I like to say, because I'm just so anxious to get to a lot of the fun stuff for me, which is using my brushes and getting that brushwork going and things like that. But putting your arm straight out, if you're going to measure like this, this is all about getting relative proportions. So, like, let's say we're looking at a building, and we want to see, let's say there's one building here, there's a building behind it, there's another building over here, there are some trees around them, a little river coming down. Well, if we want to see what's the size of this building compared to that building, or this wall compared to that wall, or the size of that building, we can, same thing when we're doing the figure, it's seeing how long the head is here to maybe the torso, how many heads go with the torso. So we can just find out that one measurement, like let's say it's a wall, and then we take that and we see how many of those, first of all, fit into the painting overall, and how many of those fit into other buildings, and how many of these walls make up the size of that tree, how many of these, that sort of thing. So each thing is measured like this with the handout, and then we just get an approximation of it, nothing exact with it. And that's a possibility too. If that drives you a little batty, because often I have to come back in and redo my drawing because I've gotten off, and it's just throwing off the whole composition. It's throwing off the proportional, the relative nature of the buildings fitting with each other, things like that. If that bugs you, then I would suggest going in and really measuring things out, drawing it out to begin with, even though I say I don't like to draw things out. Sometimes I do, especially with architecture, or something that I want to get it specifically, all the measurements correctly. Then I will spend more time, measure it out, make sure that things are correct. So there's a few ways to do that. But overall, if I'm out on location and I'm under time constraints, this works out really well. I'm just going very quickly to see how many of each thing, how these things all relatively fit with one another, and how they line up in there, how things measure out. So that's what I'm doing right here in this painting. Okay, so I go through and I kind of measure things out and figuring out the size of the bridge right there, the house right here, and then I move along after that to blocking in the shapes. At 4314, we go over here, a little past, sorry, second, 43, there we go, almost right on. Okay, so I start to block in the shapes right here.
Make that much more interesting than it is right now.
I'm not sure.
These little machines we have all over the place. Okay, so right here, I've gotten all the different, what I consider the major shapes. This big triangle of grass over here, the lawn, the lake down below, the different buildings and how they relate to one another, and some of the major trees, like the background trees, the sky area, and the big trees back behind. So I've gotten in the major shapes. After that, I take it, and in some of this video, I'm going to let it play for a little while and show you some specific things, but these are basically the steps that, the most important steps that I take in order to bring a painting like this together. So then 10309, this is where I ran into trouble. I realized that those buildings were feeling way out of disproportionate to one another, and I didn't like it. So I decided it was worth taking the time to change that. And I'll let you listen to a bit of this real quick.
Managed everything here, and I put out a little bit of extra white, titanium white, so that when I really get into doing some of the sky, I have plenty of paint to work with. So that's what I have here. Okay, so right now it's pretty lackluster, pretty boring, and this is way too much here, so I've got to do a lot with that background. So I'm going to get to that, but a lot of it is I was getting off with my drawing, and so now I'm trying to come back in and get my drawing correct again. Alright, I need to get a lot more paint in here than what I have too.
Okay, so let's see. Let me scroll through here so you can see some of the things, the steps I take. Did I redo that? Maybe I got to the back of it. Oh, so, sorry. I went right ahead of where I did that. So this is kind of what I do when I'm trying to recapture the drawing correctly. I don't have to go and erase everything. I don't have to wipe it off or anything like that. I just go through and start to adjust it. So this, whoops. So this first building right here, I felt it was way too long. And let me show you again the image. So this building right here, this first building, I felt was too long, and I wanted to lengthen out this one more. I like that this one is so small back there. I like the different small, big, and medium sizes of things. So I think that gives it a good variety of things that are happening in there. So this one, I wanted to, right now, this first building and this second building are basically the same size. And to me, that's boring. That becomes static. You know, I want to have variety. I want them to be different from one another. So I changed that up. And the way I did that is to bring the second building forward to reduce the size of the first building. And you notice I used some pretty thick paint in here with some of these strokes. Because even in the very beginning, I might have to come in and wipe some of that off if I have to really readjust something like I'm doing now. But to me, it's worth it when I'm really going for that textural effect. I might lay in, like on this roof right here, really thick paint in that spot. And then I just start to do that all the way through. Just small adjustments all around those buildings. Like right here, take out the roof right there, and then get the building behind it. Although, you know what? I still left these two guys exactly the same size, almost. I mean, practically. Nice thing is this one has a bigger presence to it because it's close to us, and this one is hidden behind like the wheel and all that. But really, the roof, they're still the same size. So, blow that theory. I didn't do that like I had intended. Then I started thinking, this tree back behind, it reminded me a lot of that scraggly tree, and how much it detracted from the buildings. So I decided to minimize the impact of individual trees in the background and really start to focus on just texture and color shapes back there. So I start to blend a lot of that together back there. All right, so let's see. From there, after I've readjusted the measurement so I like the buildings a lot more, we go to, 103, that's what I was doing there. So 103.39. Right here I wanted to show you a little bit of working with that thick paint, because you can see I have that really thick on the roofs. That's quite a bit of paint that's already on there, and I have a lot of fun with that because of the texture that you can get just straight from, rather than creating the textural look with color and value, I'm creating that textural look with actual texture, the texture of the paint. So I'm going to let this play for a bit. Okay, actually, no, I'm not yet, because that is a long, but I am going to show you slowly here the way that I do the brush, and then I'm going to let you see some of the ways that I use that brush in here. So going through in this background especially, you'll start to see, so this is something to point out right off. Look at the palette over here and see how much paint I mix up. So right here, there's going to be a lot of paint that gets mixed together right here. And then that scooping. So that's something that I do, and I didn't really notice that I did that. It was second nature to me for most of my career. But once I started to videotape and teach and trying to explain what I'm doing, I realized how much I push my brush through the paint. So I push it forward, and that's why I talk about the rosemary brushes. And there are a lot of artists, you know what, let me bring this up like this. There are a lot of artists that like the Rosemary Ivory series brushes. and a ton of artists, and they're beautiful brushes, but they don't work for me at all. So, and that's because of that pushing. I don't just push the brush through the paint on my palette. I'm also doing that often when I get onto the painting itself, pushing and pulling back and forth. I'm going like this all over with that brush. And the reason why I do that when I push it through rather than just scooping up some paint on it is that's separating those bristles. It's pushing those bristles apart so that I have it's a more interesting brush stroke and brush texture when I actually apply it. So I'm doing that a lot when I'm really going for that thick texture. So I wanted to point that out to you on that. And then here's how I apply it. You'll see it's pretty quick. I'm not going for any kind of real subtlety here. I'm using a big brush, usually about a size 12.
Everything's just been so... I was too timid with this little small piece. I needed to get much more in here.
Okay, so you hear that I said I was too timid in the very beginning, and sometimes that's, no, actually often, when I first, no, I wouldn't say often. When a painting isn't going well, that's when I often can pinpoint it to being too timid in those very beginning stages. We have to paint with confidence. Even when we don't feel confident, just go for it. Paint with, at least apply the brush strokes with confidence. And it's going to make the painting a lot more interesting and exciting, both for us as the artist and for the viewer. And that's what I discovered here is those initial block-ins of trees I felt were just too timid for this painting. And this is where I'm really starting to get it honed in my mind just how much texture I want to have throughout the painting. So you can see with those big strokes up here in the corners in the sky, that's the kind of texture I want to have at the very end of the painting as well. So I really start to go for it. The thing that people worry about when they start to paint with that kind of thick paint is how do I get little details like tree branches and trunks and things. So we'll address that here as we go along. Let's see. Let me scroll through, and so here I make up a bunch of paint again. You notice I'm not just getting
Alizarin crimson and a little bit of transparent oxide red just to give it.
So I was saying ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, a little transparent oxide red. The transparent oxide red has yellow in it, and that's to take away some of that saturation in the lavender. It's a great way to just a little bit desaturate that purple so it's not overly strong and bright. And especially when right now I'm going to be putting this into the background colors, so I want that to be a bit desaturated. But notice how much paint. There's a lot of, when I said I put out extra white paint over here, that's because I knew that when I'm going for a real thick paint texture, I'm going to need it. We can't have these little tiny bits of paint on our palettes. We've got to really put some paint out there when we want to get that kind of texture in it. So I grab that kind of paint, and then let me show you as I push the brush through again.
And a little bit of transparent oxide red just to give it, just to gray it down a bit.
And another thing is, I do not overmix my paint either. And that was a good example. Do you see that little bit of red? That's from under mixing my paint. When I put all these colors together, I'm not going for one homogeneous color. I want to have striation of color in there. I want to have some bits that are a little darker, some that are a little more colorful, that little bits of red more than, and then another spot it might have little bits of blue that are stronger. I want to have that variety in there because to me it's more interesting. And if it gets carried away, if I get like that little bit of red that you saw that really popped out of there, it's very easy to come back in, just kind of touch it with the brush, and it's gone. But as you can see, even within something like this stroke right here, there's that red right there. This is brighter right here. Not quite so much red in this spot, more blue in that area. there's just a lot of different striation of color and variety of color and value. Not great differences in value, but little tiny nuance shifts of value and color so that it's more interesting and more fun to look at. So I've pushed that through, and then I just go through this whole thing, getting in some of that background color. All right, so that's how I lay in something like the background, and it might start to look a little bit messy, but it's this whole painting. I think the whole thing was 2.5 hours. So probably with before editing, maybe 2.5. Probably 3.5 hours of total painting time, and so it's quick, and it's just really it comes down to thinking through the process, having a clear idea of the process when we start out, and then the more, if you're timid about painting with that kind of thick textured paint, that amount of paint, then just play with it. Do it practice with this, experiment with it on a painting that isn't crucial for you. It's not critical. And if you're just starting out, don't let any painting be too critical to you. I know I can kind of remember, I think about the first painting I did when I was in art school, and it was the first oil painting I did, not the first painting because that was back in high school, but the first oil painting that I really did was in art school. And I just remember how excited I was. I did little kind of almost rounded brush strokes everywhere in it. I was thinking impressionist minded. And just when I finished this tree and things, I just thought, oh, that's so cool. And I wanted to be so careful about damaging it. And yet it's the less we get concerned about things like that, especially in the early stages, the faster we're going to progress. And even when we get to a point where we've been painting for 30 plus years, it's important not to become timid, not to become cautious. We need to have confidence and bravura in order to make them fun. If we want the viewer to really have fun with it, then we have to have fun with it as well. And sometimes that takes risks. And there are times when, just like you saw earlier, where I had to go and rework all of that. But it's oil paint. We can rework it, and it's going to turn out all right. We can scrape it all off if we have to. Yeah, we've spent a little bit of time with it, but in the end, if it comes out with a much more powerful painting, then isn't that worth it? So be courageous. All right. Then, so you've seen some thick paint here. Then I decided as you can see with this color that's back here, it's really not letting the building pop out. The value of the roofs right here is about the same as the values behind it, to a great extent. I mean, we got this dark spot over here with that one, but otherwise they're kind of blending with each other. So it's not really letting those buildings pop forward towards the viewer. So I knew I had to work with that to get those buildings to pop out. So at 147, and I really work with this, when we're going through putting in thick paint texture, you see this, I do that everywhere, on the buildings, in the background, in the water. I start to get some thick paint down in the water, in the rocks. You can see I really start to work with that paint. But it's different values, different colors, depending on which area that I'm working on. Okay, and I go through, I mean, each thing it seems like it's kind of tedious when I go back and forth and readjust and change and all of that, but it's still a quick process. It's still a very rapid process and still spontaneous. I'm having so much fun with the whole thing that it doesn't seem like work. It seems like a challenge, But that's a lot of the fun of it, is that challenge. So even working with thick paint, it is not that scary. The real key to working with thicker paint, when it comes down to it, is getting enough paint on your brush. So like right here, I'm about to put a stroke down right there, and I have to make sure, I have to make sure that when I lay down that stroke, that the paint comes off, and the paint doesn't, I'm not taking a brush and blending, pushing that paint into the paint that was already there in such a way that it blends the two perfectly together. Because then I generally will end up with mud. But if I take that brush and I have plenty of paint on the end of it, and I do that by pushing the brush into the paint and building up a ridge of paint on my brush. And if I get too much, you know, now it's kind of second nature, but I can kind of feel if I have too much paint on there. Usually I don't know if I don't have enough, but often I'll know if I have too much, and I'll just kind of knock some of that off on my palette. But I grab some paint by pushing it into the paint, that edge of it, and then I come over here and I just lay it on top. And I lay it in such a way that it lets that paint just kind of fall off onto the other paint. I'm not pushing it down in so strongly unless I want to do that. I'm laying it on top. And then if the bristles spread apart a bit, then some of that paint that was there before can come through. And I can, after that, once I've got it laid on top, then if I want to manipulate the edges or bring some colors that are around it, it's all still wet, so I can grab from spots around it, or I can grab from the stroke that I just laid down there and kind of push and pull them together so that they feel like they belong with one another. So let's see if I do that right here in this spot. So I'm just laying in some thick paint right there.
And that's too much red all the way across, too much orange. Oops. So I can just come across and pull some of that off there.
So now you see how I just lay on a glob of paint, depending on what I'm trying to do. With something like this roof up here, it would be one continuous stroke of color across there generally, and then coming in and refining the edges. And like on this edge down here, I came back in with a brush and put some on the, rather than a stroke going horizontally, I did a couple of strokes vertically just to bring in some variety to that, to break it up, to change that some. And then a little bit of a stroke maybe here on the end, that sort of thing. Okay, so at 143, what was this? 147, that's where it is, at 147, right here. So this is where I decided I need to get some more going on so that those roofs will pop out more. And
matching up with the top of the roof there.
Okay, and I also noticed...
So I want to bring all that...
So this is another principle. This is a principle of design. The line on this bank back here, it's really a road back there, this bank of grass, it was coming up right at where this roof was, and they were both lining up. So I got this one continuous line right there. I decided I didn't like that, so I'm coming in and changing where those lines, so they don't meet up with each other, I'm changing that. And it's so easy to do when we're working in more abstract ways with just large shapes. The thick paint, you know what, there's nothing easy about any of this. Even working with thick paint, there are a lot of times where it gets away from me. It just does. That's part of the challenge of it. It's part of being courageous with it. But when it does, we can reclaim it. That's the whole point to it. It doesn't have to be it's messed up, it's all blown. We can scrape it off, we can do whatever we need to. There are often times when I'm trying to get one brush stroke just right, I have to go and do that brush stroke maybe 3 or 5 times, where I go back, I grab a bunch of paint, and I do that brush stroke. If it doesn't look right, if it doesn't work right the first time, I do it again. Sometimes I'll do it right over the top of that brush stroke, or other times I might scrape it off and try it again. It really depends on everything around it and how it's affecting what's around it, if I can paint on top of it or if I have to scrape it off. So there's nothing critical about any of this.
Down. Let's look at this. And everything's too light back here, so I want to bring in some dark so that these roofs stand out better.
So I wanted to point out, when I bring in, so like I was laying in these vertical strokes right here pretty carefully, trying to get them to be in the right placement. After that is when I could get really vigorous. You notice I just pushed and pulled that brush all over to get interesting brush marks in here. And that's what this painting is all about, is those marks. It's about making marks that are fun and that are interesting to look at. Okay, so then let's see, 42 to 54. Yeah, let's see, we maybe a little bit more than that, just to show you. And I'm using the edge, I'm using the flat, I'm using the corners, I'm turning and twisting my brush, just getting constant.
And that will also help that sky have a stronger backdrop to play against.
So getting constant variety in there is what it is. And I think that's it. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to 218, where I start to work on the will itself. Okay, so right here, and in the end, especially in retrospect, when I look at it now, I really could have changed that. I didn't do the will. There were some things that weren't as accurate as I would like to see them be now. Overall, the painting, I love the painting when I finished it. There were so many things about it that I really liked. But that will was not one of them. And I'll show you why that is. So let's see, 1, 2, 18, 45. So about right here.
There's will in place anyway, so we'll leave that window, that second window, for a little while. I'm going to work on the will. And I want some color with it.
You'll notice throughout this painting I'm using different types of brushes, different sizes of brushes. For the most part, the majority of this painting is completed with two types of brushes. The hog bristle flats, especially the long flats, and well, in the Rosemary series, it's the Masters, the 279s. And what I like about those two types of brushes, the long flats, like the Rosemary Ultimate or the Rosemary Classic long flats, is that they have a lot of spring to them. I like that longer rather than the brights. So with the brights, they don't have nearly as much spring, and they're really good if you want to scrub in paint. But for me, when I'm working like this and I'm wanting to get those separated bristles like that brush texture, and I'm wanting to I hold the brush back a lot when I'm doing that towards the end of the brush, and I really want to just let it flow and kind of dance around on the painting. The longer bristles have a lot more spring to them, so it works really well for that. And with those long mongoose type, it's a mongoose replacement. It's not actually mongoose anymore. But the mongoose replacement brushes, with those, it's the same thing. They have a lot of spring to them. And with the mongoose, they're just a little bit softer than the hog bristle. So really a lot of that comes down to just the artist preference. As you work with them, you'll start to get a feel for when you want to grab one and not another. And I grabbed a round right here with that same mongoose replacement to do some of this, so I have a little bit more of a pointed end to it. But oftentimes, it depends on the day. Sometimes I'll just grab the same kind of brush, maybe a long flat, or that's where I often will use a bright in the mongoose replacements. Like it used to be the Asabi 6158s. Today, I don't know what they are. 279? 272, something like that. What is it? 274. So like in this case, This one is not as long, and so it gives it a little bit more, a little more control to it. These long ones, I guess you should probably see what I'm talking about here. Okay, so with these, this is the difference between them, except for, like this is a size 3 and this is a size 8 over here. Yeah, oh, size 6. Okay, so here's a size 6, here's a size 3. You can see there's quite a bit of difference in them. This is the long, extra long, and this is the more of the what's considered like a bright, the regular long. And it this one, I have more control when I want to put in like a oh boy, how do I describe that? I do have a blog post somewhere about all of that where I really thought it through. But this is more just to show you the difference between them. This one, if you really want to have strong control over it, these ones aren't as good for that because they tend to there's so much movement in them that it's a little bit harder to control. They're great for, I was going to say these are great for certain branches when I'm doing trees, but then I thought about that too. And actually, each one of them, you want it so that you can get a really thin edge to it. But I will use this, I often will hold it back here like this on the brush and just move it like this, kind of just with 2 fingers. With this one just kind of guiding it a bit, but really it's just about letting it kind of dance in there. This one is when I want a little bit more control, and I'm going for a more definite, like rather than, this is great for laying paint on top of, but not scooping into. So if I'm using a lot of thick paint, if I want to get down into paint that's already on the painting, this isn't going to work as well because it's so soft that it's going to have a hard time really working into that other paint. But let's say I want to bulldoze my way through that other layer of paint that's on there. This is a great brush for that because it's stiffer, so I can bulldoze my way through it. So there you go. That's the difference between those. All right, so we get back to this. So I start to use that round just to get the overall drawing in place here because I don't have anything drawn out, so I'm just eyeing all of this. And something to keep in mind is I have these pictures. They're on my computer monitors that are 12 feet from my easel, so I don't really see the small detail very well. If I really need to understand what's going on with the architecture, then I'll walk over to my monitor and I'll study the actual details of that architecture more closely. But overall, when I'm over at my easel, I'm going for the overall shape, much more so than the particulars of it. And when I'm doing architecture, I probably should pay a little bit more attention to the particulars because they can get really important and get out of control pretty quickly. But I don't want this to feel like a stiff, every little thing drawn in there. And so my struggles with this will come back to that, where if I just wanted to get it accurate, then I could just take and start measuring everything out, get it all exactly the way it is. But I was trying to be more, feeling as if it was more carefree than that. And to get that carefree feeling and not get too caught up in the details, that's a really difficult balancing act right there. And that's what I struggled with through a lot of this will. So I get some of that put in here, and now you see I moved to a long flat again, and I start to get some of that thick paint in there. And I was still, so here I start to lay in these slats, and I realized once the painting is all done, I realized these slats, they should, okay, let me put you over here. So I have the slats going, let's say like this. I should have done it the same all the way down, but I start to go a little bit, so when I start off, a couple of them at the very top are almost a little bit angled up, and then they angle kind of flat like this, and then when I get to the bottom, I suddenly angled down. They're not supposed to do that. So that wasn't accurate. Don't follow me on that part of it, because that was not right. Yeah, as we start to, eye level does make a difference on the angles of things, but the eye level it shouldn't have changed that angle of things. And I messed that up. So I noticed that afterwards. I wasn't paying real close attention to that in the early stages of it. So that's just the way it goes. And that's why I say I love the other parts of it, but the drawing part of it, I could have done a lot better with that. Overall, though, the painting sold. I can't change it, but that was one thing I would change if I had it back. Maybe. I don't know if it's really important.
Enough paint, and
so this I wanted to show you, though. Putting down one of the slats. So here I got that long flat. I get enough paint on the end of this brush by pushing it through into that paint, and then I just use that edge to create the, instead of drawing it like this, I use that edge to place that whole thing in all at one time.
General direction from that to here. Oh, so that would be from that corner to that corner.
So that's where, when I'm doing the live things with our members, it's much easier because they will let me know in the chat, hey, we can't see anything. You forgot to switch the cameras. Okay, so this right in here is where I start to do some of the trunks of the trees in the background trees. And notice when I'm mixing the paint over on the palette how I really undermix that paint. Okay. So I grab, this is for some of the color that I tried to put in there. I grab all these different colors.
A lot more paint than that.
And you'll see here is where I really undermix. See, I just do a couple of swipes with that to get it moving its way through the pile. And then boom, I'm grabbing a bunch of different color on there. It's not just one homogeneous color. And then I'm using all the different aspects of that brush. The tips, the corner, the side. I'm utilizing all of it to get those strokes in there. There comes some little tree trunks. So just like that, I can go in and add a little tree into that area. That's why in the early stages, it's not so critical to try to get every little object placed in here. We get the overall big shapes put in first, and then we can come in and start to add things here and there to our heart's content. It really depends on what the painting is telling us it needs at that point. All right, so let's see. Till 2:48. So here's where I can start to get some of those tree trunks in here. And I
have a little bit of that lavender in there, so I can gray down that yellow a bit.
And
come in here and
the lavender I'm talking about was what was left in the brush.
That's a little too bright still.
So all that paint back there is still wet. I can go right into it and play with it. And then because it's wet, I'm also grabbing some of that other color, and it changes up the values and colors as I move.
So I just let it pick up the colors that are still wet around it. It's one of the things I love about the Alla Prima, if I can work it out, because it gives me that opportunity to have the colors intermix like that, just picking up color from around and bringing it out.
And that's how I do. That's all the way along here with these tree trunks. And in some areas I want to have it less distinct. In other areas I want to have it very distinct. It really depends on the push and pull. I want to have some things feel like they're going back into the distance, in amongst all the foliage of the trees. And so I'm going to have leaves coming over it. It's going to be broken up a lot more. Other tree trunks are going to be much more visible to the viewer because they're out here towards the viewer closer, and they don't have nearly as many little branches and leaves that are going over the front of it. So it's just back and forth a lot that way. let's see, and it goes to, oh, and here, this is how I get, just bring in some extra color into this with a big brush. I take that same color and then I might put it in other spots around in there. And it's all intuitive. I'm just seeing how I kind of bring it over to an area, say, and I look and think, does it feel like it needs it right here? And then I'll lay some of that in there. I'll throw it, and that way I can. It's creating that consistency, the harmony of that throughout, and it's giving me variety by doing that. Okay, you know what? Let me go to 303, 09. So in this area, I'm going to get down here to the lawn, and because to me that lawn right now is just too green overall, and it doesn't match up with a lot of the other the atmospheric colors that are throughout the rest of the painting. So I want to tone down that green some, and this is how I do that. So I'm just going to let that play for a minute.
Often it's just anemic. So this is just so green right here. It's not matching the overall tone of the landscape. So I need something to help it feel more in harmony with the rest.
Back and forth. So I never work on one area necessarily completely. Sometimes I do. I guess I shouldn't say never, but I rarely do. I'm jumping around all the time throughout the painting. Just something will catch my eye. I'll see where it needs something, and oftentimes I'm just trying to bring it up, the different
Well,
spaces
that looks pretty dark.
together.
Definitely don't want it to be too... I want to bring some of the color that I have in this upper down into here as well. And of course that has to be not nearly as bright as what the actual object is. Just kind of the semblance of it a bit. And it's really just to break up this space here. There's a reason for that.
Alright, so let's see. And you'll notice here shortly that I add a lot more orange to that green over there than what I have just right there. And with these reflections, the key to a lot with reflections, especially if we're looking at adding texture and that sort of thing, for me, I don't want those reflections to draw attention away from the buildings themselves or to have too much focus on them, but I want there to be a lot of interest anyway for the viewer to go down in there and enjoy it. So there's still plenty of texture as far as paint texture goes, but I'm subduing those reflections so they're not nearly as bright, they're not nearly as dark. So like the darks that are in the wheel right here, the brights that are in the wall of that building, the brights in here, when I put those reflections down into the water, I subdue those so that they aren't as bright or dark. That way It still has the idea of that reflecting in there, but it's not nearly so powerful. It doesn't have as much attention to it. Let's see, and then to the nuances. Basically, this is it. Okay, so actually when I said earlier, I was off. So this painting took me closer to, it took 3 hours here of 3.5 hours. So this is more like a 4 to 5 hour painting, sorry, in the completion of this one, not a 2.5 to 3 hour painting. Okay, so at 3:00, oh, what was it at 3:05? This is where I show some of those, adding little tiny touches here and there. 3:05:49. It's right in this area. You'll see this is where just adding little things. At this point, it's all about just the tiny nuances. And is there a brush stroke that seems too obnoxious, that stands out more than it should? Is there, anything that doesn't seem like it fits with something else in the painting? Is there an edge that needs to be softened or made more sharp? Should I brighten up an area or tone down an area? That's really the final 10%. And sometimes that final 10% can take longer than the whole rest of the painting time combined. And other times it's just little tiny things that take 15 minutes to finish. In this case we have about 25 minutes worth of little refinements and nuances. Take you through a little bit farther here to show you some of the real. So there you can see I decided to put in a lot bigger bit.
I wasn't real thrilled with that little break between them. Hopefully that's better.
Yeah, right before that, if you
give it the feeling of something.
This right here, I did not like that little. To me, that's distractive. Those are the sorts of things that I'm looking for. Anything that might distract, and the way that ended right there, that was distractive. So I was trying to stay away from these two becoming a tangent, like they're just kissing each other right there, but it definitely needed to be changed from that. So I did put a little bit into that, change that up right there, so that they are kissing each other, but it worked a lot better than having that hole right there between them. And I didn't know that would be the case until I actually did it, and that's the way it worked. And then, let's see. Here's the...
better.
And then I decided too much green still, so I come in with even more color and change that up. And see, it's really...
Yeah, that's a better color than that green. So now I have...
That was what it's all about. It's you notice I just laid the color over the top of that other color. All that green is still wet. It's still easy to manipulate, but by pulling the brush across, and I do it with kind of a vertical motion rather than pushing the brush, like coming at the brush straight on and then pushing across. I'm leaning the brush sideways, basically parallel here to the painting, and then I drag that across the top, and it just pulls that brush off on top of that thick paint that was already there. So that's how I work with thick paint in it.
This triangle of green, but none of them are too... this one I have grayed down. I just have that little spot of bright green. It does kind of give an overall sense of a brighter green, but I think it's subdued enough. And I like much better the composition bringing the lake off over here. So I think that's working. Got a little dot there that does not work. And this kind of thick.
And that's how when the paint is all wet, Alla Prima, we can come in and it's so easy to just push it into the background paint. I lay that stroke down on top, and then if I don't like it, I can play with it, and pretty soon it just dissolves back. Little spots dissolve back into the rest of the paint. The blessings of Alla Prima. You notice with the feeling of getting those little ripples on the water.
Too many lines?
Doesn't have to be real bright. And if I don't like one, I just
That's
soften it out. If I think I have too many of them. Okay, let's see. And is there anything else that would be beneficial?
It can get carried away. Yeah.
Let's see. So I'm just going in now and adding little nuances, fixing edges and things here and there. Let's see, with the paint, what did I do to the sky up there? Just adding in some extra color here and there. So that is it. That's really the process that I go through to do a painting with thick paint like that, and when I'm concentrating on texture. So I do experiment here with getting in some brighter paint down in there. But you notice I quickly dull that down again because it's just too much. I was trying to get a little bit more accurate reflection, but I had to make sure that they weren't, and that those reflections were definitely not too strong and coming through, because then they become a distraction. So there you go. And here, let me show you once more the original image. So here's what was there, and here is what the painting looked like at the end. So you can see it's lots of little tiny bits of color here and there just to give it interest and variety. But overall, it really doesn't look like the original image right there. Big difference between the two of them. And so that's where we do not have to follow the reference image that we have. We can have a lot of fun with it, or we can follow it exactly if we really want to, if that's what our goal is. That just wasn't my goal. So I hope that was instructive for you, that there were some principles involved in that were helpful, and hopefully you can get out and enjoy your own something with a will like that, an old mill. That was really a fun piece to work on, and I'm so grateful to our member who donated that picture for us. So if you want to see more of what we do, we talked about the paint togethers that we do. All of that, just go over to masteroilpainting.com. You'll find all of it on there. We have an incredible community of artists, and we have a lot of fun together. So I do, actually this next Saturday, I'm going to be doing a live demonstration like what you saw here today, but it's on a Zoom room, so we all see each other, we can talk back and forth, and we get to have a lot of interaction with one another. That's part of our membership. That's what we do in the membership. So have a wonderful day. Get out there, do some Alla Prima painting, go paint on location, and be confident and courageous with your brush strokes. Just get in there and don't worry about it. If you feel like it messed up, so what? Go and scrape it off or paint over it, whatever you have to do. It doesn't matter. It's oil paint. We can do anything we want to with it. So many possibilities. So just don't be timid. Be courageous, have fun, be confident, and pretty soon you're going to just see amazing things happening with your paint when you do that. All right, have fun and happy painting.